Hello, little helpers. Welcome back to a very exciting week and a very exciting guest. Kibby and I had this idea to do a spirituality series. We'll see how far we get with this, but basically the idea was, where does spirituality intersect with mental health? What are kind of the psychological teachings of various religions and spiritual systems? And we wanted to bring in a really exciting guest named Jess Cook, Reverend Jess Cook, to start us off. So Reverend Jess Cook is the pastor at Every Table, which is a new worshiping community in Richmond, Virginia. Jess holds a Master of Divinity from Union Presbyterian Seminary. They were the first openly trans and non-binary person ordained as a minister of the Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church. You notice I paused there because last time we tried recording this and I said Presbyterian Cemetery. So thank you for catching that, Jess, but welcome.
It feels relevant to the conversation, doesn't it? How is this thing functioning? Thank you very much. It's delightful to be here.
So just for starting us up, can you tell us a little bit about your journey, how, being trans and non-binary in this church? I mean, How that's felt to you, how that's been for you, how people have experienced you?
Yeah, so I could talk about that for a while. So I should also name that I'm 43, so I'll be 44 in May, and I feel like my age is relevant in the conversation because as somebody, I think just because I have this lived experience of actually growing up without any language around my identity and then learning about it actually from when I was working with young people and working with young LGBTQIA plus youth. And so, yeah, I grew up in Northeast Texas in a town called Longview. It's a couple of hours east of Dallas. And looking back on my childhood, I can definitely see me like where I've always been as a, I identify as non-binary, genderqueer. I don't really feel like I appreciate being neither male nor female. I appreciate really kind of just being ambiguous in a way. That feels most at home. And I grew up, I can look back and see pictures of myself. Like I have this picture of myself. I grew up swimming. And I have this picture of myself standing on the swimming blocks before a race where I was, I think 6, and I've got my arms kind of out and I'm just standing. I'm like, there I am. But after that, I'm aware that so much of my life, like I started to kind of cover that up, right? And that was, I think, protective because there wasn't language around my identity growing up. I think the only thing I can remember really even about the LGBTQ community when I was growing up was about AIDS. And, that was all really we knew. Ellen DeGeneres came out my senior year of high school, which is a funny marker, and Ellen's complicated, but in terms of how the public discourse around really gay and lesbian people pivoted. I think with her coming out was a shift, and particularly white gay and lesbian people, but I think there was certainly an impact in terms of how the society experienced that. But I was still really closeted to myself, certainly with both my sexuality and my gender. I also identify as queer with my sexual orientation, or I guess pansexual, but really just I appreciate queer. Yeah. But yeah, I did my undergraduate work at Baylor University, which is a big Southern Baptist school. Like I was really kind of clueless about myself in a lot of ways. But I found the art department and studied photography, but also had space where I was seen and affirmed and could be kind of weird in ways that I am. And that was a real saving grace, I think, also in teaching me how to ask questions, even if I wasn't yet ready to ask questions about my gender, or really even my sexual orientation at that point, but kind of got into that. I think I finally started to come out, as I was in college, just come out to myself, but more even after. And it was in graduate school, actually, that I did after my undergrad at Baylor. I got a Master of Fine Arts in photography at the University of North Texas. And my whole MFA work was on race, class, and gender expectations from my hometown. And I made these portraits of women who were primarily a group of women who were my age, who were going through these rituals, getting married. Particularly, they were at that age or that period of life, some starting to have kids. But all of the work was around these rituals and practices, particularly around gender, that had really no meaning. We may do them in faith spaces, but they don't really mean anything other than this social adherence.
Can you give an example?
Well, so I think with a lot of the way that we treat weddings, I think a lot of the way that we talk about marriage in a way, I mean, I think the way that I mean, that's a whole conversation, but it was just sort of, it was very much like we just do these things because it's what you do.
Mhm.
It's like, this is what you're supposed to do. And for me, it's funny because I never once wrote about my gender identity in that because I didn't even at that point have the language. So I was writing about, you know, gender norms and expectations and being a lesbian, quote unquote lesbian, at that point, which didn't have a correlation, right? But I think it was for me, I was very interested at that point in, I think, sort of figuring stuff out for myself, but also looking at how religion functioned in that as well. I thought is really interesting to look back on. And so I went from there. I ended up meeting my now ex spouse in 2000. At the time I graduated from my MFA program, in that fall we started dating. We grew up in the same church in the same hometown in East Texas, but they were at a point where they were about to start seminary.
Mhm.
And so they started seminary here in Richmond. And we dated, and I ended up moving to Richmond at the end of 2008 and to be closer to them. And then I audited a class in the spring of 2009 with a woman named Katie Geneva Cannon, who was the matriarch of womanist theological ethics. And it was on day one of that class that I knew I was going to go to seminary. And it's funny that as I'm talking about my gender journey, I'm talking about my seminary journey, but they're
Uh-huh.
they're so intricately tied that it's kind of hard for me to separate them, which is really interesting and I think relevant to our conversation.
Mhm.
So then throughout seminary, it was in my third year of seminary that I got an internship at a nonprofit here in Richmond, which is now called Side by Side. It was called something else then, but I got a nonprofit working with LGBTQ youth. They serve 11 to 20-year-old youth. And I was there as a seminary intern. And I found that as I was there, like I think when I went in, I had these ideas, that I was going to go talk to churches and build bridges and do all this stuff. And I found that I really just loved hanging out with youth, and really loved the space, the authenticity that comes in a group space like that. And so I ended up then, after I graduated with my MDiv, I ended up working at Side by Side. There was a job that opened up. There were only 3 people on staff, so small. But I ended up working as the youth programs director there from 2013 to 2017. And it was in that time that as even just if you look at how language has expanded around gender, that was a really explosive time.
Mhm.
And so I started hearing all these kids talk about, or these young people these youth talk about their experience around gender. And I would hear these stories again and again and start to think like, these have a really strong resonance in my own experience. At that time, I think I was even still I think I would say my pronouns were they or she. So there was still always a really kind of like, I think even when I said I was a lesbian, it was always like it felt like a weird, I don't know,
Mhm.
rather than using, I don't know, like people used to say female pronouns. Feels like a decade ago, rather than the specific pronouns. But I was always like, no, just this is specific is she is okay. It was even before I was doing they, but it was always this kind of ambivalence that I think when I was actually seeing these experiences of young people, I started to see my own, relationship with my body. I had an eating disorder when I was in high school that I had saw again and again with young people would happen. It was when I quit swimming competitively. And so I started gaining a little weight and I just like, that was dysphoria. I had a
Mhm.
relationship with my hips that was it was all those things, but there wasn't ever language for it. So then when I left Side by Side, I kind of gave myself permission to really explore. And I wasn't walking with this journey with other people, but I really started to explore what does it mean to start testosterone? Like, how do I feel in my, like, how is that? And so it was in October of 2019 that I actually started testosterone. And I was 40 at that point. So earlier that year, I'd been ordained as a minister. And so like I literally turned 40 and a month and a half later, I was ordained on June 29th of 2019, which was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, and
Wow.
which just happened to be the day.
That's what, yeah.
And then I started testosterone in October of that year. And so it was interesting because really what that meant was that I went through my second puberty at 40, but also during COVID. And so it was sort of an interesting time period just to have this transformation. And it's been fascinating because since then, I think particularly with all of the things that have happened in the last few years and the ways I think that we are all like talk about it like a collective gut check, like my experience around gender has been really transformative. And first, I think with starting testosterone and realizing how much that really led me to consider embodiment, which then led me to consider healing, and particularly around white supremacy in ways that it functions in my body. And realizing that as I started listening to my body with gender, with around what dosage I wanted for testosterone, I was like, I don't think my gender is the only thing that's been keeping me from really living here in my body. But there's this culture that we have that tells us to avoid our bodies, our lived experiences. And so that's been a real gift in that way. And then it wasn't until just in terms of physical transition, I had top surgery in September of last year. So at 43. And that's been a whole journey as well. Like, I feel like that's been a real, like, that's a whole, I literally feel like between those, but like, especially with top surgery, there's a part of me that's literally come to life in ways that, that is transformative on both a physical and a spiritual level. So that was a very, like, I don't know if that
was awesome
info. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so curious. I have like a million questions. I'm so curious about your internal experiences. I want to know what it was like in high school when you I guess you felt something, you were questioning something, you were struggling with something, didn't have words for it. Like, what did that feel like? And then I'm so curious about what it was like, when you're saying this so transformative spiritually, and personally in many ways to have top surgery. Like, tell me, tell us all about that.
So I have this picture of myself in high school that I remember, and part of my own, I'm clear that part of my own, I would say call in life at this point, is to tell my story just for all of these reasons, because I'm of a certain age, like I had this lived experience where like, I get it that like, I didn't know what this meant either. But also as I look back, I have this lived experience where I can point to these different memories. And like I can remember recently, like when I was in fourth grade, we had a poetry reading competition at my school, like a UIL thing. And I read a poem by Shel Silverstein called The Long-Haired Boy that was about a boy who had long hair and everybody made fun of him for it. And he sat down and he cried so much that his hair he started to shake, and then his hair started to shake. And then his hair became wings and flew out of the window, and he's flying around the city and people are like, oh, come save us, come save us. And he kind of smiles and a little tear falls from his eye, and then he just flies off. And I was like, I knew exactly who I was. Like, yeah. I mean, and I was a badass in fourth grade in Longview, Texas. I'm just like, got it. But so I think like I think there's interesting, because when I think about them, by the time I was in high school, I can remember there's this image that I have of myself with 4 like girlfriends from high school. And I was on my high school dance team. So I did high kicks, it was drill team, but like I did the whole thing. I was in a sorority. I did the whole girl thing. I tried so hard, but I was a debutante. That's a whole conversation. But I can remember, so there's this picture and we were all wearing unitards with this like fringe down the legs, and very Texas. And everybody was laying down, like heads different directions, but everybody's laying on their stomach. So you've got this basically row of butts. Does that make sense? Like, it's kind of like, I mean, everybody's like cute doing this thing, but I'm sitting up in the back. And I have such a clear memory of that moment because I hated wearing that unitard because my thighs, like I hated it. And I was like, I do not want my body visible in this picture. And I sat up right as the picture was about to be taken. And it was like, I look back and I remember so clearly, but again, there's no language. There was nobody say, this is because your gender identity is this, and your body doesn't know how to make sense with what it experiences in this world in such a way. And like, so I think looking back, thinking about testosterone, I'll start with testosterone because I kind of brushed over that, and then with top surgery. But with testosterone, it was a moment where I said, this is something I need. And I realized that like, and I don't know, like it was also just giving myself permission to try it, because you're not going to have you're not going to be a huge change from one trying, and it was also like this leap of faith in a way where it was like, I was listening to my body in a way that I don't think I ever really had, in a way that like my body was saying, this is something I need, but it was like I just got to a place, and I found also that our bodies do that. They'll keep us safe in a way, and then they're like, okay, now it's time to know this, which I think is just, I mean, that's how trauma, right? That's how we, I mean, and so so starting testosterone, though, it was like, well, how will I know the right dose? Because I don't identify as a man, and it was really important to me not to be immediately read or always read. Like I feel at home in androgyny, and I'm more comfortable if people misgender me with he, him. Like that happens a lot. It's a lot different than she, her, and but I knew that I probably didn't want the same dosage that a lot of the trans guys or a lot of the non-binary masculine folks that I know are on for testosterone. And so I asked, like, how will I know the right dose? And they said, well, you'll feel it in your body. And I was like, okay. So then sure enough, I started at a low dose and I increased that dosage and hit a point when I was like, oh, okay, this feels good. And then I tried a little higher and I was like, oh, that's too high. Like, that's too high. I just knew. And it was at that point that I was like, wait a second, like, I really like I'm listening to my body in a way. And it's like, but that's where I was like, I don't think my gender is the only thing that's been really keeping me from listening to my body. Right. And so then I started, I think just giving myself permission to explore that, like, what does that actually mean? And that then led into a journey of just really looking at healing and like my approach to how I engage life. I think I'm starting a new church and we're focused on healing and looking at all the ways that white supremacy and capitalism have really malformed us. And it's like, we don't even know what that means. But I found that as I've started focusing on that and I've started being more aware of what's happening in my body, and this sort of somatic practice, my partner in the new church, Charles, is a yogi and is getting the yoga therapy degree right now. And it's like, it's very much like we talk about the breath, we spend we spend time in silence. But that has all been about like really learning what it is to be in my body. And then with top surgery, it was really interesting because it was in December of 2021 that I first said out loud, I think I need to take top surgery seriously. And there was a number of events that had happened before that were just kind of precipitating that would like sort of open I opened my eyes or opened my consciousness in a way. But I was finally able to say like, no, this is something I really need to take seriously. And it was, as soon as I sort of named that, it was like, oh no, like my body was like, I was very aware of just how much I'd been like holding, in that. Like I can remember being 6 or so and going outside and not having a shirt on and having this very clear moment of like, this is not okay anymore in this way. And I think that it was after top surgery, which was in September, that I actually went outside for the first time without a shirt on since then. And it was like, it's funny talking to like cis women, who are friends, and they're like, oh, I go around, I love being topless. And I was like, oh, that's a different experience we have. But it's sort of this thing where I realized like how much of myself, like I would literally talk about my chest as a dead zone. And as I'm thinking about yoga and energy work and chakras, it's like, that's my heart chakra. Like, and also it's just any part of my body. But like, so when I think about that, that's how it's been transformative. And gender has absolutely been the part of that I think has been the invitation in my embodiment to really, it's a real like freedom in a way.
This could so easily be 2 podcast episodes. So I'm trying to figure out pacing because I want to hear so much more about this and I want to get to the role of Christianity. But what's striking me is that, it sounds like your body may have been this place of discomfort, like an uncomfortable home in many ways. When I think about my body, it's also kind of uncomfortable and I don't feel very connected with it. But what seems different is that you've learned this really intense and intricate connection with your body and really understanding it and how it works and all of these influences that has played on it. Yeah, I don't know if there's a question in there. It was just striking me.
I do have a question about that when you're saying that, I remember feeling young and being like, I hated my body. Many people feel that way. I mean, like all teens at some point are like, ugh.
Right.
If for youth who are trying to figure out these questions, is there like a difference in feeling of like, oh, actually, I think this is my gender that doesn't feel like my home, or is it like teenage years are hard? My bodies are developing and I don't know who I am at all.
That's a great question. And I think it's it kind of a depends, right? Or it could be a both and. Like what I found also a lot of times with middle schoolers, I would hear again and again parents who would come, because with our middle school group, parents had to consent to their kids being part of the group. And so we would do an interview or like an intake conversation. It was an interview. It wasn't an intake because we were in a clinical setting. But for these, we had a middle school support group. And when we would talk to the parents about why do you feel like this is a good space for your kid, I would hear them say again and again, like, I just lost my kid. And it was the trans like there was a language where I feel like I lost my child. And as you look back on what happens with the onset of puberty, for cis kids or for trans kids, there is realizing the onset of those hormones can function as a toxin in the body. And so the way I kind of likened it is that if you think about a cisgender man suddenly lactating, where you're looking and you're like, what is happening to my body? This is not supposed to be, supposed to be happening. I think that there's that experience for a lot of kids around their gender, around being trans, there's a different kind of way that it comes out, and so a lot of times it can come out in relationships with clothes, in relationships with friends. I think a lot of times even just giving kids the space to kind of have a conversation about it, I think helps tremendously. And I think we have a lot more parents who are a lot more versed and a lot more kids who are a lot more versed on it. In terms of being able to say, oh, this is something that maybe I'm experiencing, and like will kind of advocate for themselves in a way. And I found if a lot of times the distinguishing factor would be the experience of the young person, right? So for kids with gender, I think knowing eventually there is a space where they'll kind of tease out, oh, this is something that's really going on around my gender, in a way that I think cis kids, it just doesn't, I don't know, like it's a different level of intensity, I think, a lot of times, at least in what I've observed. And also my experience is mostly with trans kids, a lot of trans LGBTQI plus youth, but particularly with trans youth and questioning around gender. I've also found that, I don't know if this is the case with y'all, but like a lot of times people really know who they are, and I think with young people, I found giving the space to have an informed conversation about their own identity makes a tremendous difference, in them being able to really kind of claim who they are in a way that I think exhibits the real sort of sense of self that we have at our core. But I think our job, for me, I think my job is to offer that structure, to offer that structure and that language, even recognizing that language is going to surpass or transcend where I am.
How were you welcomed by the church while you were undergoing this transition?
Oh, so the church. So there's a real particularity around being, like, for me and my lived experience around being somebody who, like, my gender has been very key to my sense of call. And in a way that, like, I knew that I had to come out as non-binary to everybody before my ordination because it would feel disingenuous to my sense of call to be ordained and to have she, her used. And I didn't know necessarily how or why. I can see that much more now because of the embodied experience that gender has really brought, and that, like, they, them is, or non-binary, not she, her, is really key to sort of who I am. And so with that, I think, it's like, I mean, for anybody working to help really pivot an institution that is built upon, the intentional exclusion of that identity, you're going to deal with certain things. I think the church as a whole has been really mixed. I was in the process for a decade, which it usually takes a few years. And that's because the denomination at the time that I started the process, I couldn't have been ordained. And so I saw a real pivot. So, like, I've heard people say things, I've heard people have said, and part of being queer in the church and being visible, I talk a lot about, like, that it's not a sin to be queer, that it's not a sin to be, gay sex is not a sin, like, it's not a sin. And that obviously, gay gets a reaction from certain people. But I would say as a whole, like I am so relational. Like I'm clear that like, I just love people, and I think part of my role as somebody who educates is like been inviting people along in that. And so I found that, people are people, and they're going to say stuff. And also like I'm currently, like I do a lot of work in the church in spaces, and people are getting there with pronouns. They definitely know I'm non-binary and they're affirming of that. I just last year was part of a search committee that hired the new leadership for this presbytery, which is a geographically defined set of churches. And I was part of the leadership I was the co-chair of the committee that hired that new leadership. And so as a non-binary person, so like to be, like that's a certain level of affirmation and trust that comes. And, I found that a lot of times, like there's a certain level of vehemence. Like the church has done a lot to really poison a lot. Like the church, like if you look at all of the atrocities of the last 2 centuries, the most grotesque of them have been funded and driven by the Christian church, the quote unquote Christian church. So I think for me, I think it's been a helpful bolster to have the community of folks that I've had at points, people who came before me, and to be grounded in community in a way that's helped. But I mean, it's the church is an institution made of people, so it is flawed. And I find that for me, I can live with myself a lot easier in ways that can name that, like because as a queer, like I'm actively part of something that has been the most destructive force in the lives of LGBTQI plus people, and that doesn't, for me, I'm here for Jesus, and the institution will do what it will do. I'm committed to the church, but also not at the cost of what I feel called to proclaim.
How you mentioned before that your spirituality and your gender discovery, your journeys are intertwined. How did that feel? What do you mean by that? Like, tell us more about how that happened.
So, I don't know. I think that there's a sense, I think a lot of it comes down to embodiment, as I think more and more, and if I were to talk right now about God, if I were to define God, right, I think God is energy. God is, I would define this sort of cube of golden light, right? And it's a cube because it's beyond space and time. And that's the only way I can conceptualize it. But I think there is this collective energy that does draw us together. I think that it is love, because I think that's the only thing that makes sense. I mean, what else is going to actually keep us together while also expanding, right? I mean, when you think about it's just practical, because everything does want to find balance. Everything does want to be drawn, and so for me, I think whatever that energy is, as I find that I am more intentional about being in my body, being present in meditation, in yoga, in mindfulness, and sort of like how I engage the world outwardly, I am more aware of the presence of that energy in myself and in everything around me. And I am also more in tune as I read scripture in this way. I'm like, wait a second, Jesus is saying the same thing. Like he talks about the kingdom of heaven a lot. And that's just saying like, this is here all the time. Like that it's this reality that's in front of you, that you can determine, but that you have to experience it in your body, because that's what we're here for. I think. And so for me, as I learn to be more in my body, I am claiming space here in this way that then I'm also finding breath here. And I think with that breath, I'm learning how to be centered. I'm learning how to be more present with discomfort, with all of those things. And I'm learning how to accept it. And I think that is a core of what my spiritual journey is about as well. And so I think I'm literally experiencing more of the presence of the divine. And on a physiological level, it's funny because I don't wear binders anymore. And so I'm literally breathing better
expanding
in this way that, like, as you talk about breath, it's like, whoa, but that's a little more heady. But I think on a very practical level, it's like I'm learning how to be in a way that is, I think, transformative. And I think that's what I think most religions are saying anyway, learn how to be with what is. That may be an overly reductive way of saying it, but definitely an overly reductive way of saying it. But I think loving yourself and your neighbor is part of what that means, I think. But
I'm trying to figure out exactly what my question is, because like 5 of them are competing. I get before Kibby asked that question, my question what was going to be what makes you like, given that the church, the institution made of flawed people, has been the source of so much suffering, especially for, this group of people to which you belong, what was worth it in continuing your life in this institution? I feel like in part you just answered that. So do you have more, or should I?
Yeah, well, so I think, so that's a multi-part thing, in working with young people. I think it's also realizing, I think we need all people. I think we need spiritual homes. I think we need a way to connect to one another in a way that enables us, to transcend ourselves. Dr. Cannon used to say, Dr. Katie Cannon, who was my professor and mentor, who meant so much, who I took that first class with. She used to say, oppression works when it's theologically grounded. If you can convince people that some sort of deity has ordained that they should have power over another group, then you can enable them to commit a whole host of sins.
Yeah.
And I hold that. And one of the things I wish I could have said or had a conversation with her about before she passed in 2018 was that I think liberation does too. I think oppression, and I would actually tweak it a little and say, I think oppression works when it's religiously grounded, and liberation works when it's theologically grounded. And I think there's a difference. So I think for me, when I talk about what I think Jesus as a person came for, was to show us what we can do in these bodies, to say, this is what it is to be divine. This is what, and which he says clearly that we are all like him. And even when you talk about, so this is another thing that like, Christians have a real great way of saying Jesus was nothing like us, but then also saying he was totally human. It's like, nope, we don't get those. So for me, I think like those experiences of like, for me, what I'm finding is I think we need that. And also I feel like people need to know who Jesus really was, but because I think they need to know the message that he actually said. And so this is a connection point that I have to a way to actually communicate that. But I think, even in thinking about scripture, we so often make this assumption that scripture is anti-LGBTQ. And yet if you look at like Acts 8, for instance, well, like, first of all, scripture is not anti-LGBTQ. I'm just going to say that, but it's actually pro LGBTQ. And I'm going to say that in a way that like recognizes and acknowledges that we don't actually, this language was not a part of the conversation 2,000 years ago. The way we're talking about gender right now, the way we're talking about sexuality, the way we talk about relationships is so different. But there are a couple of things I think I want to lift up, specifically one around gender. And that is the Ethiopian eunuch, who in Acts 8 is actually the first person to carry the gospel internationally. So you have this story where Philip is on the road and meets this Ethiopian eunuch, who is both a foreigner and a eunuch. And the ways people could be eunuchs, they could be born intersex, they could become eunuchs, so they could be like forcibly, or they could actually choose to become, and often for ritual, like for practices, pagan practices, right? Or ritual practices. So this is somebody who is both a foreigner and a eunuch, which is explicitly barred in Leviticus from the kingdom, or from the presence, from the assembly, but is explicitly included in Isaiah. So Isaiah specifically includes eunuchs and foreigners. And then here, when you talk about in Acts, which is right after the Gospels, this is the very early church. And the person who is the first person who takes this message, Philip meets the eunuch on the side of the road. They talk about the scripture. The eunuch gets baptized and then goes and takes the message home. And it's like, this is radical. This is a Black trans person, right? Who's there on the street, who actually like takes it, who has very strong connection to the queen, right? So they've got a lot of, it says he in scripture, but this is, it's an explicit inclusion. And when you talk about where is this message, like who is the first person that this story is going to tell, as far as like, who do we really want to embody this? That's the Ethiopian eunuch. But then when you look at the stories, even of when Jesus was born, there are two gospel stories that tell about Jesus being born. One is in Matthew, one is in Luke. And in Matthew, is when the three magi come to visit. They're not wise men, they're magi, they're magicians, they're astrologers. They're coming from another land, right? They are coming in, they defy the emperor, and they come, and then they flee by a different route. So like when you look at this, it's like those are outsiders. Like that's not anybody. Like those are people who are not welcome, right? And they're the ones who are celebrated as those who are there. And then when you look at Luke, it's shepherds who come, who are dirty. They're ritually unclean. They're there, and it's like, who's here, right? Who's actually here? And then when you start to look all throughout Scripture, you're like, well, who are the people who are most often called, right? Of the people who are most often specifically called, invited by God to be messengers, prophets, whatever, how often do those people actually look the part? Like how are those good church going people, for lack of a better way to put it? And they're never, right? You have like Nathan, who had a relationship with David, and then you have Isaiah. And I'm speaking very specifically, I realize, for a different audience maybe, but it's important to lift up that like everywhere throughout, like the people who understand the message of the Spirit are the people who often the institution has said don't belong. So I think there's a lot of affirmation there. I think it's helpful when talking about sexuality that like Paul had a very different understanding of sexuality than we do. And certainly had a different understanding of how we function in relationship. I mean, his assumption was that like women were property. So I think let's hold up. And there was no language around homosexual. Those were not like, that's not, there were certain assumptions about how people functioned and how the world was that were based on his worldview that were not, that I think are limiting. And that's a more nuanced conversation for sure that we could have. I don't know if it's relevant to this discussion, but for me, even again and again, then you have very explicit language where Paul, again, in Romans 8 says that there's literally nothing in the universe that can separate us from the love of God. And so I think, Jesus again and again is talking to the people. Like he never has harsh words for the people the church rebukes. He has harsh words for the people who are in the institution. Those are the people he has the heart who are in the religious institutions and using those institutions to exploit, to disempower, and to abuse. And so that I think is really affirming, because then you look at who is being exploited, disempowered, and abused by the church, because that's where Jesus is. And so for me, it feels, like I think people, I can remember sitting in a group of like visiting a high school GSA, Gay Straight Alliance at one point, in a group of like 22 youth and high school kids. And they were probably half of the kids were Black, half were Latinx, one white kid in the space. And I can remember I mentioned that I'd been to seminary, and I said, so if y'all have questions about what you've heard the Bible, let me know. And they didn't know who Moses was, but they knew Jesus was going to tell them they were going to hell for being queer. And I was like, when you think about, I know so often, particularly in the Black church, the function of the Moses narrative is so relevant because it is all about freedom and liberation from these systems. Like it is such a strong, powerful, and it's like they didn't have any access to that, but they knew Jesus, and which Jesus never said, right? Jesus actually affirms eunuchs as well. So I think it's that thing where it's like, I think part of it is also just like, I'm here for the actual message.
Why has this happened? I mean, this is...
Well,
yeah, we're like, what went
I mean,
wrong?
do you want to go back there? We could go there if you want to go there. I mean, I'm not even joking, but like, I can literally go there because those are the conversations I've been having lately.
I kind of want to go there.
Let's go there. But I'm also, go there. And
I'll briefly go there.
I have a follow-up question that I'll,
Okay. So I'll briefly go there. And this is my hypothesis at the moment. So 318. Literally 318. Constantine was about to go into battle. He had a vision of a chi and a rho, which he perceived as the two letters of Christ, that under this sign you shall conquer. Constantine won that battle, became the emperor. Shortly thereafter, Christianity becomes the religion of the empire. 325, Constantine says, like, the church has these different theologies that are coming out. Things are sort of, people are figuring out what they're doing. Constantine says, we need to figure this out. We need to have a council, get together and figure out what is basically like, what is your theology? Where are we going? And particularly with the relationship between God and Jesus, like what was Jesus? So the emperor called this council. Out of that comes the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is still like I'm Presbyterian. It's part of our Book of Confessions. Catholic, I mean, it's part of a lot still. It's the earliest ecumenical creed or confession. But in this, there is a word that they use to describe the relationship between the Father and the Son. They don't say Jesus and God. They say the Father and the Son in there. But that word in Greek is homoousios, which means same substance. So they say that Jesus and God are the same substance. Now, what's tricky is that that's not biblical. It never says anywhere that Jesus is the same substance as God. Now, I think we're all the same substance as God, but it is very clear from scripture that Jesus has a very particular relationship with God. I'm not debating that. But what I think was lost in that council was that Jesus was the same substance as us. Jesus was us. Jesus came very clearly to say, this is who I am human. Like, that's the whole point, that there's an incarnation and a presence here. But what happened from that Nicene Council is that there was this idea that like Jesus is God. And then what does Jesus look like? And Constantine drew from the image of Helios, who was the sun god, who was blonde-haired and blue-eyed. So then you have this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus that shows up. So white people, right? You have white Jesus, the idol of white Jesus is cast. White people are then given this image of the divine that they are never going to be able to make, right? Like there's this idea that, we should look like this because it is specified in this particular way, but it's also built on a lie. Jesus is up here, we are down here, and Jesus is with the empire. So you have the church broke off at that point. But that was a pivot point, I think, in history. If I were to talk about one of the most dangerous words in human history, I think homoousios would be it. Because, and not because, but because it specified this relationship of Jesus that was apart from us. Jesus was put on this very high pedestal. And the whole point of Jesus living was that he was human. So then you look, and then you start looking a few hundred years, you're a few hundred years in, the church starts doing all this stuff. But then Jesus shows up on a cross around 900 years. Like Jesus didn't show up on a cross until almost 1,000 years after he died. Before then, the cross wasn't part of the language, wasn't there. But then it's like around 900, it's like, well, what else is happening? Oh, the feudal system is starting. Land ownership is starting, right? So then a year later, you have this theology that comes out that says that Jesus, that's when atonement theology was written, around 1096, I think. But you have this language that says then Jesus was punished because we should have been punished. So then for like this atoning sacrifice, which is also not the way that's not what scripture means. The same year, the Crusades are started. So the overlap here, I think the parallel when you talk about how do we get here, it's that we have these distorted theologies, right? We don't know what to do with Jesus saying, we are all here. Your neighbor who is suffering is you. We are all part of one. We are all here. So we distort because we take this person, this figure, and we make him the figurehead rather than realizing he's saying this is all of us. But it creates this distorted theology. So then we're trying to live into this thing, and we create some really messed up theology in the meantime that then a few hundred years later leads to Jesus on a cross, leads to the Crusades, which was just a land grab that was sponsored by the church. The person who wrote that theology was the Anselm of Canterbury, which was the arm of the Catholic Church in England. And it's like, we're writing this theology. Who's closer to God? White people, right? The savages, those are below, right? And so then it's like, and then there's restrictions on the body. There's restrictions on who we are. There's all of those things. I mean, the Puritans came here, had this really beautiful opportunity. If they would have actually engaged with the native people to say, this is what we know of Jesus, they could have said, this is what we know of creation. Maybe we talk together and we could build something beautiful. But instead they whited it. I mean, they did what white people do. I mean, but, and so for me, I think that's all connected. I think it is all connected. And that I think it's important that we name it because, again, for me, I think if I'm going to live with integrity as a pastor, I feel like it's really important to know what I'm part of. And because I think within that, there is still this history where you have this movement that says we're not going to be part of it. So early on, you had the desert mothers and fathers, parents who left, who said, we're not going to be part of empire. We're going to go do this. I mean, you could talk, the whole existence of the Black church was built upon you talk about a refusal to actually accept the white supremacist, oppressive nature, but actually become something as a source of liberation with that same language, I think is evidence of that spirit that's present. But that's a long roundabout way how we got here, which may not have been relevant, but I think it's
it's cool. I love a history lesson.
So, I know. Yeah. And I feel like I need to listen to this part of the episode over and over and just let it sit.
We do.
I just have to digest it because I'm listening from the perspective of we're talking to the loved ones, right? Of people who are of youth, of anyone who is questioning, exploring their identity, in all different ways, right? And I was just thinking about my question as we were talking was like, okay, how does someone who is like, I'm a devout Christian, I've been taught all my life that the blonde, blue-eyed, skinny white Jesus is and heterosexual is the right thing, and that everything else is bad. And especially when we talk about mental health, we a lot of what is hard about mental health is that people naturally want to know a right way. They want to judge what's the good, what's bad, who's bad, what behavior is bad, how do we correct the bad thing? Like we constantly want to be right. And that could be suffocating, that could be restricting. But for like a mother who is very, very Christian or very, very religious in some way, and it's been taught all their life that, like that the one piece of the scripture that, I don't know, people have hooked on to is like, this is evidence that Jesus hates gay people. Like what? I love that there's at least like more to it, and there's more language and history and scripture around. Wait, that's that you can't take only one piece as
right.
So how does like a mother of a youth, or how do the loved ones who maybe identify in this kind of community or way, or more conservative, or just, I'm talking about the people who are sitting here listening and being like, what do I do? How do I support? How do I, stay faithful to my religion and also support my loved ones,
Right. So I would say for those folks, start off by giving yourself permission to consider that what you've been told has been wrong. Mm-hmm. Like to give yourself permission to actually ask that, right? Dr. Cannon used to say, I didn't know I'd be quoting her so much this week. She used to say, do you think God would make a rock God couldn't pick up? So often we're afraid to ask questions, right? And so I would say to folks, if there's something that you have been taught that is so offensive that you cannot even ask a question of it, then I would give yourself time to consider whether that's actually faithful advice, or whether that's actually someone trying to use this religion as a way of minimizing your access to knowledge or understanding of knowledge. So I would say give yourself permission to do that. I would say there are a number of resources that people can read that like are helpful depending on where people are coming from in terms of their own context. There are actually some great books and resources that sometimes folks like having a book and they like being able to go through. And so there are a lot of books that will deconstruct these different, like the 7 passages in scripture that allude to behavior between people of the same sex. And so I think you can offer a lot of times that, a lot of times it's also just getting back to like love and what does your heart actually say? I think one of the things that's most dangerous about the church is the way in which it can convince parents that the way that they can love their child is to actually harm their child, right? Like I knew parents who did horrible things, who were very abusive to their children, and that it was advocated by the church because they were trying to beat something out of them. And I would say to that, like, pause and just give yourself time, because a lot of times if people are willing to if there's that much of a disconnect, then there's that to me is an indication of a real level of trauma. And so for that, I would actually invite people to recognize whether or not, like, even just on a, like, that's not that severe. I'm not going to beat my kid. I'm not going to do whatever, like most parents aren't. But I think it would be like, invite yourself to just pause for a minute and to ask yourself, like, what is it that's being expected of me and at what cost? Because I think so often parents will throw their kids out, right? I knew a mom who set her, like, through all of her children's, like all of her child, and I'm going to say child in that moment, even though that they were 18 years old, all of her child's clothing into the yard and lit it on fire.
Oh my God.
Right. And it's like, what? That's trauma. Mm-hmm. That parent, that's right. So I think, like, that's something. So I think it's like, I would give myself permission. And I say this as a pastor, that, like, I know for me that, like, the way I talk, like, meeting people for whom Jesus is triggering, that's real. So for me, if I'm going to talk to somebody and I'm going to convey whatever love or whatever, like, I'm not going to talk about Jesus for them, because that's going to be triggering for them. I'm going to embody what I understand the spirit that Jesus embodies, in that way. But it's one of those things where and I say, as a pastor, yes. And do I feel I'm being faithful in that? Absolutely. Because the important thing is this person sitting there with me. And if I think the love of God can only be conveyed with this particular word or these particular language, then I'm actually making an idol of that wording rather than, like, letting myself be present in the love that is.
And he said no idols, right?
Actually, that's the first commandment.
Okay.
That's the first one. That's the very first one.
Can you tell I wasn't raised with religion?
Yeah, but it does. It's the first one, right? And he said, yeah. And again, if you actually read, who is Jesus talking to? Who is Jesus advocating for? It's like when we tell the story of the Good Samaritan, there's a story where this is the story where somebody who is coming down and he's been beaten so badly that he's dying on the side of the road. And he's a Samaritan who, in the chapter just before this, these literally two of the disciples had asked if they could destroy this whole Samaritan city because the people were so awful. And God's like, Jesus is like, no, chill out. No, but like they like literally like just the chapter before, this is the pointed enemy. Mm-hmm. So this is the person suffering on the side of the road, and it's two religious folks, right? It's two church leaders. I'll say they're not church leaders, obviously, because they're synagogue, but like two church leaders who are walking by who ignore the person on the side of the road. The person who actually tends him is the one who is close enough, but like in that language, it never says that he's good. We call it the Good Samaritan, but his action is that he's actually close. And I think then the goodness of God moves through him where he acts like a human, right? He does what I think any of us would do if we're with someone who's suffering and needs help, hopefully.
Yeah.
But he allows that sort of closeness to move. And like, to me, when I think about Jesus, it's like that he's literally modeling and saying this person who you hate is actually your access to experiencing the divine. Because the Samaritan experiences the divine, so does the person suffering. The people who miss out on it are the church people who are walking by because they've got more important things to do. So for me, a lot of times I would also just point that out, like spend time with scripture and actually read and look and see the greater narrative that's happening here. Because Jesus never says anything about queer people going to hell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ever. So yeah.
I don't know how to condense this question. So again, I was raised by like, my dad was a hardcore atheist, and I went through my whole college phase being like, it's stupid to believe in God, it doesn't make any sense. And now I'm much more interested in how you don't have to believe in the supernatural aspects to understand scripture as containing really kind of elemental psychology, like, and my example of this, but I don't know if I'm interpreting anything correctly ever. I was reading this book called Quo Vadis. I don't know if you know it. It's a Roman epic. Okay. Mm-mm. It's basically, it was written like 150 years ago, but it's about the Christian persecution. And this is before the church. This is just, the teachings of Jesus. Paul and Peter are, kind of the leaders of this movement. And there's a lot of death in it, and there's a lot of relating back to Jesus. And I guess what I took from it is that the story of him dying on the cross and then being reborn felt like it was more a lesson about if you can confront the greatest amount of suffering, the greatest kind of suffering in this life, and confront it virtuously, staying true to your value, your, view, then you will experience a kind of rebirth, a kind of fearlessness, a knowledge that nothing can annihilate you because, you already went through it. I've got my two kitties, running around behind me. Yeah. And that might be totally crazy, but it's just what I took from it.
No, I think, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, well, the only other thing I was going to say is that that's just Viktor Frankl's message too, in Man's Search for Meaning. And so
I think that's actually, I think Jesus was coming to say that, I think we focus on the death, right? But it was really, I think, about the resurrection and this, there is living into such an extent, living into this belief and this truth to such an extent that death is actually irrelevant is the point. We make it about suffering. We make it about punishment. It's not about those things. And it's also not about the cross. It's about the resurrection, but the cross is the way to get there. And I think also, I read recently this anonymous quote that said, the God that atheists don't believe in never existed anyway. And I really appreciate that, because I think for me, in that, I think what I would say at the moment, and in terms of reading Christian scripture in this way, that I think there is this, I think our reality is our energy, right? And I think that it's like reading quantum physics in a way where you like talk about these different realms. And it's like, I think that's what Jesus was saying. There just wasn't language for it. But basically it's like, if you think about, if you're actually functioning in alignment with the flow of things, life's a lot easier. And so even just from a mental health perspective, right? If I am anxious about something that's maybe going to happen or maybe not,
Mm-hmm.
has that anxiety ever helped? Like sometimes if I'm in a fight or like if I actually like fight or flight, yes. But as a whole, day to day, that's not where I am. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
is also freaking out about something ever actually helped? Like if the worst does happen, like is freaking out about it beforehand ever actually really helped? Right.
Right.
So there's a steadiness and a presence, right? It's like the plans that we make from a place of urgency and scarcity don't usually work. Right. The plans that we can make when we're paused, or even the decisions that we make when we're paused, we're clear. To me, when I think about it, it's like that's actually getting into alignment with the energy that is, if that, which I think is the way Jesus talks about it. It's like, I don't know if that makes sense, but, or if it's relevant to what you're kind of bringing up, but I think you're actually a lot more on track. I think the church has actually been, certainly with all of the morality, Jesus says, in Mark 7 has this quote where he says, you have a fine way of abandoning the commandments of God in favor of your traditions. And I think that like so often what the church has become about lately is we're going to just do this thing. We're going to just do it, but we don't know why we're going to do it. And I think if we don't know why we're going to do it, then why are we doing it? Right. And if anything, that actually does piss God off in a way. Like in scripture, it's like God gets pissed off about like worship that is done for the sake of worship, but not, I mean, is done for the sake of the practice or the things, if that makes sense. So to me, when I think about it, it's like, I think there's an alignment there to like, even just what you're talking about is that I think it's like, it is about living in such a way, living in it. I think that's what Jesus does, is that he lives in relation with his neighbor in a way that he really pisses people off. I mean, I think that's why it kills him. I think that's why they kill him. Because that's what we do.
So what kind of lessons of Christianity do you, probably so many of them, it's a stupid question, but if a kid comes in, and they're feeling depressed, anxious, like they lack a sense of belonging, I mean, how can Christianity help them?
Yeah. So I would say affirming. So I think one of the things with Jesus especially, and I think what he came to say is that God's presence is always with us. God, and that's always with us. A lot of times affirming, a lot of times if somebody comes in and as somebody who's part of the church and if they've experienced church trauma, I will first off just apologize and to name that, to say I'm sorry for what you've experienced, and not in a way that like makes it about me or claims responsibility, but says like just an empathetic I'm sorry. I think affirming that there is a message of like love and affirmation, that's absolutely what Jesus was talking about, that he's talking about being with those who particularly are oppressed, particularly those who are marginalized. Howard Thurman is a 20th century mystic who talked about Jesus and the disinherited, that Jesus was among those who'd been disinherited, whose backs were against the wall. Like, so I think for me, when I talk to folks, I think it's just affirming that, and really trying to live into it, also holding space for people's grief or questions or feelings or trauma. Has been really key because it's a healing. And so I think it's also, there's an important thing to realize that it's not a one-time thing, but it's actually an ongoing process of healing. I would say also get yourself into a space that does affirm. Like there are affirming churches, there are affirming places of worship. So I would say that would be really key too. Don't continue to stay in an abusive relationship.
I have one more question to piggyback off of Jacqueline's question. For the loved ones, parents, siblings, friends, extended family of a youth or anyone who's struggling with their sexuality or identity, gender identity, what practical, because we could come away with this with the loved ones, I mean, like holding, supporting, holding space, asking questions, being open, right? But there's a lot of people, and like me included, I'm thinking about like, if I'm a new mom, like what if my son comes to me and, has questions? A lot of people I think are afraid to say the wrong thing. Like even if they're well-intentioned, they're like, oh my gosh, all right, how do I say the right term? How do I make sure I say the right pronoun? What resource do I send? And I think a lot of people are frozen because they don't know exactly what to say and do. Do you have like very practical, like, here's what you can say, here's what you can do?
So I would say first is recognize that you're going to mess up. right? The language is evolving, even just around like my pronouns are I would say are they, them, or AM. Most people don't know what AM is. That's fine. We're not going to have it. We're getting there. Maybe, right? We're moving there, right? But so I think realizing that like people are going to mess up, and that there's a way to also, if you mess up, just say like, I'm affirm that you're with the person, right? Say that like I'm with you and I'm learning and I love you, and I realize I'm going to mess up, and that's just me learning with you. I mean, I think naming that, being willing to do that, is really important. I think being willing to also admit that like you're like I don't know, I think is really important to say and to Google, right? Even just to look up, you could look, there's enough, I think, resources online now that you can actually probably look up a question related to whatever it is that you're seeking, and find resources that would be able to affirm some of those questions, depending on what you're looking for. And I would say like, give yourself permission. I would say like, for me, when I think about it, it's like you're signing up to be along for the journey, right? It's not a 1-point conversation, but it's like really like, it's a journey. And with that also realize, and for you, expect that you'll be transformed. Like I think one of the things that I love about what happens when parents listen to their young people, in terms of particularly trans folks, I think this is true with LGBT folks as well. But I think with trans folks, there's a particularity around watching families or parents go through that process with their kids or with their young adults or with their adult children, that if you allow yourself to really start asking those questions too, it really becomes a transformative thing for everybody. In ways I think we do need to ask questions, right? I think we do need to ask question our assumptions about gender, because if cis people understood gender in the way that trans people understood gender, it'd be like if white people understood race in the way that people of color understand race. Like, it's like, so I think there's I think giving yourself permission to be transformed, I think, is part of it. And to trust the love that holds you. Like a lot of times in Christian contexts, it's like, like I say again and again and again, that we are loved beyond measure by a God of infinite abundance. And like that message, or that trust for the parent, if there's fear or anxiety, right, that's coming up around your kid's salvation, then investigate that for yourself. Right, in a way, because that's also going to come in for you, because your kid is actually showing you a way to experience God in a really transformative and expansive way. And so invite that and recognize that like there is an experience that you're being given, or an invitation that you're being given. But folks, a lot of times, if you're still stuck on stumbling blocks, right, of how do also I would say, don't see your kid's gender identity or sexual orientation as a reflection of you, right? Or as something that you have done right or wrong, right? If your kid comes out or doesn't come out, that doesn't mean you've done anything right or wrong, regardless one way or the other. There are some parents who are like, "Ooh, I want my kid to be queer." I don't know if there may be, but like, where it's like, why, right? I want my kid to be whole. Mm-hmm. I want my kid to know who they are, and I want my kid to be able to be safe to express that. And I think being willing to do that, because a lot of times we think we know so much about a certain thing, but a lot of times when we react most strongly to that, it's actually an indication that it's a vulnerability, or we actually know maybe not a lot about it. That may be overly reductive, but yeah.
I was supposed to have only one more question and then ask for resources, but then you left that teaser in there. So the teaser being, I just want to go like this, like the teaser being, trans and non-binary people understand gender in ways that cis people can't. And I've often kind of wondered about this, because it can feel difficult to understand sometimes, because I'm a woman, I'm happy with that. I can't locate the boundaries of my gender. I can't figure out what's feminine, what isn't feminine, what that even means. And so in a way, it is like a kind of color blindness, like I can't see this thing that other people can see. So can you speak to that at all? Or like,
yeah, well, so I think it's like, for me, there was a point early on in like gender conversations where I started to actually say, like, what does it actually mean to be a woman? Right. And that point, that was for me the beginning, where it was like, oh, it turns out I'm not. Right. But I think that I think asking yourself those questions is really important. I can remember before I got married to my now ex-spouse, people kept asking us why we were getting married. This was before marriage was legal. And so I started asking straight people that when they were like, oh, we're getting married. And it's like, well, why are y'all getting married? And they're like, oh, and they would always talk about how they got engaged. And I was like, you don't know why you're doing this. You don't know why you're doing this. Mm-hmm. And that was really eye-opening, because that was a moment for me where I was like, oh, there's an asset here. right? Like that, I actually know why I'm doing this. So then with gender, it was like asking that. And I started even just thinking about why did I do things, like even like I think shaving at one point, it was like, why do I shave? And there was a point where I was like, oh, sometimes I want to, sometimes I don't. So I would or I wouldn't, right? But it was like, why do I do this, right? And then that comes into all of these dynamics that show up in relationships in all sorts of ways. I think if like, spending time with, when you spend time with folks who like, when you start talking about their gender or sexual orientation or how they are in relationships, you start to tease out that like a lot of things feel restrictive in ways that people don't really let themselves name because it's just sort of what is. And it's like, the thing I love about being queer is that it's like all bets are off. Like, what does that even mean? So from there, I feel like I get to actually start creating things rather than just sort of acting from a manner of deduction or just like, because this is what's here. So I think that there's a lot there that, it creates a more playful context too. Like I love my gender.
It's pretty cool
in ways that, yeah.
Okay. Do I only have one? Okay. So one more question is, this is a case that I was hearing about recently of someone who's actually very kind of gender affirming in general, but then their own brother came out as trans and they experienced a lot of grief and anger. And my interpretation is partly that the way it was almost like this vague political idea of how they needed to respond. And when it became personal, it was like, it didn't have that former way of responding didn't have any of the contextual factors, but they didn't feel like they could be authentic and all. So what can you do in that situation if you want to be supportive of your sibling, but you've got all these feelings you don't feel comfortable with?
Right. So I would say honor the feelings first, and don't express them with your sibling. Honor them and express them in a healthy way because you're feeling them, right? And so for me, recognizing that those feelings are symbols of the society, right? That like your sibling is actually hitting against those boundaries of. And so I would say honor them, and also like I think it's really healthy to realize within yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm really angry about, or I'm just really bothered by this. And to differentiate that from your sibling's experience. I think in the same way, it's like, that's where it's important that we can turn our attention toward the institution which expects us to function within a certain way rather than like our response when a particular person embodies that identity. I don't know, does that make sense? That may have been kind of vague. But I think as a whole, I would say, just like with other things of like, check yourself, because that's where that's coming from. But honestly, like give yourself permission to say like, oh, I'm feeling this, and I would say avoiding, a lot of times there's language around like honor the grief, but I actually heard a Presbyterian minister once talk about, actually, this is funny. This was Hunter Schafer, who's the actress is on Euphoria. Yeah. So her dad's a Presbyterian minister and her mom's a Christian educator. And so I heard her dad once, and I wanted to be sure that they were, but like that's fine. But I heard her dad once, we were on a panel together, and Hunter and her dad and myself and one other person. And I heard her dad say, that he was talking about this experience of seeing her wear high heels for the first time. And he realized that he was experiencing this moment of grief. And it was like, oh, okay. Like I've heard parents say this. It's like, okay. That's okay. Because it's always painful, right? To hear people talk about the grief of this person who's living. It's like, but this is, and he said, but it was so great because he said, and I realized that what I was grieving wasn't the loss of a daughter, but what I was grieving was the death around unassumed expectations that I had put, or unacknowledged expectations that I had put around gender. And some things need to die. And I was like, yes. Like, so I think in that, recognizing that the grief is not over a sibling, right? What is dying there is this expectation that to be female or to be male or to even be your sibling needs to only exist within these parameters. And so I would say in those moments, can you invite yourself to instead see that what is dying here is these assumptions that had actually been put upon you, put upon your sibling, put upon, society, and those things need to die, and that grief happens with part of that. But I would say pivoting that, I think that's what I was trying to get to with the institution thing. But I think it's like getting to a place where it's like, you have a sibling, because in reality, a lot of times trans folks coming out does mean that they continue living. I mean, there are a lot of folks who the option literally becomes, I can come out or I can die. And so there's an irony in that. It's like, nothing is dying here except your expectation. So I think just honoring that is helpful.
Awesome.
I'm just sitting here in awe, and I really do want to listen to this episode over and over again, and just like the history and the everything.
It's funny we went there.
I know. I love that. I was like, oh my God.
Like, oh.
So I'm like sitting here in awe and like processing everything. But, just for people who want to delve into this more and want to understand a little bit more of what you're talking about, these resources that you mentioned and you and what you're doing and your church and mission, can you give us some resources from your own work and also anything else that you find really helpful?
Sure. So I can start. I can also email those. I can send those to you if that's helpful as well. But I would say, so for Every Table, the church I'm starting, you can find us on Instagram at everytable804. The website is everytable804.org. And it's myself and somebody named Charles Bowling. We are gathering we're focusing on embodied reconciliation with the first and second commandments as our guide, kind of what we're saying. And the idea is that we really want to be healed from the ways that white supremacy and capitalism have taught us how to be in the world. And so what that means is that we gather, Charles and I think for both of us, it's like I think also within the space, inviting difficult conversations, inviting a real unpacking of scripture and how has scripture been misused. So we'll spend time kind of talking about that. The gatherings, we meet on Sunday evenings at 5 p.m. and we actually do meet on Zoom. So we have a Zoom link if people go to the website. The gatherings themselves are contemplative. Like we start by affirming the goodness of our bodies in our baptism. And then we have a reflection and then spend 10 minutes in silence. And then I talk about scripture and then we have communion and then we share a meal. And then once a month, we actually, on the first Sunday of the month, we only share a meal. So we just gather. I mean, the idea is really that our intention is to be close and to learn how to heal. So a lot of somatic work, breathing work. As I mentioned, Charles is a yogi and is getting a yoga therapy degree to really focus on somatic abolition. Like, what does this look like in our bodies, and what does that look like to bring that into community? So that's been a really exciting. Just I think to kind of just to see what happens when people gather with the intention of healing. I think especially, I love queer folks doing church, because if you want to talk to people who know how to do church outside of the church context, then talk to people who've been told they cannot be part of the church and who know that there is something within them that needs to actually connect to that as well. And so we're pretty chill in ways that I really appreciate. So I'm also on Instagram. People are welcome to reach out to me. I'm at Rev Jess Cook on Instagram and TikTok, and people are welcome to reach out if they would like to connect, to ask questions. Other resources, I would say there are a number of resources, depending on if people are looking denominationally. You can go to mlp.org, which is More Light Presbyterians, but it's just mlp.org is a faith-based Presbyterian sort of resource that you could go to, and there are resources there, like different things around faith. And you can also look at, there are a handful, but I feel like I need to send you resources.
Perfect.
We post them on our website, so
yeah,
it'd be
great.
really
Okay.
helpful. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, Jess, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm still chuckling that. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a delight.
It has been a delight, and I'm very grateful for the history lesson because I'm a history buff, and so I thought that was really cool.
Awesome.
Helpers, if you love Jess as much as we did, please remember to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and we'll see you next week.
By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval